Hi, and welcome to a new episode of TLDR, CISPA's podcast series. In case you're tuning in for the first time and have no idea who we are, CISPA is a German research institution within the Helmholtz Association, and we're researching all aspects of information security and AI. We are located in the lovely city of Saarbrücken, not far from the French border. We chose the name TLDR for our podcast because that is short for too long didn't read. We want to save you the hassle of reading long research papers yourself. So we talk to our researchers once a month and try to get them to explain their work so that you can get a glimpse of it without having to be a cybersecurity expert. My name is Tobias Ebelshäuser from CISPA's Communications Department, and today we're going to talk all about time and why it is important to keep it synchronized. Joining me today is Dr. Christoph Lenzen, who joined CISPA as a faculty in 2021. Christoph has recently been awarded with his third research grant by the ERC, which are some of the most prestigious grants researchers can hope to receive. Christoph got his first ERC starting grant in 2017 and has now been awarded his second proof of concept grant, building on this first starting grant, which means that the European Research Council trusts his fundamental research can be transferred into a product for the industry. Congratulations on the second ERC grant, and thanks for being here on this podcast, Christoph.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here.
Before going into too much detail on how your research could benefit the industry, how would you summarize your general research direction?
I started originally from the theory of distributed systems, graph algorithms, but then also fault tolerance, and with a particular focus on time synchronization. And then starting from my postdoc years, we began to consider how to apply these theoretical ideas to make hardware systems more robust and reliable. By now, this also really goes into the bowels of actual systems and how to make them more resilient. And in particular now, as we will talk today, for synchronization procedures.
Okay, let's maybe start right at the beginning. Maybe you could explain a little what distributed systems are.
So for me, the difference between a classical system and a distributed system is that rather than about doing the computation itself and doing that efficiently, the challenge is the communication part. I may need to learn about different parts of the system, what the situation is there. Maybe I need to coordinate or agree on something. This is very different from the classic setting where the assumption is, here's your input, tell me what the output is.
Mm-hmm. So that would be classical computing, me sitting in front of my laptop, typing something, I give an input, program gives me an output.
Yes, although I can tell you that even your computing unit, from my perspective, can be considered a distributed system too.
Okay.
Simply because at the speed of computation, sending a message from one part of your chip to another part takes more than one clock cycle.
Okay, so the classical definition for distributed system would just be very basically two computers talking to each other.
Or many.
Okay, and as you already mentioned clock cycles, I think we should get into the topic that I already teasered, because today it's all about time, as I said. Why is time important when it comes to distributed computing, and what is your research into that focus on?
Well, let me give you two examples for where time actually matters in such systems. Yeah, let's do the two we're actually going to talk about later. Mm-hmm. The first is actually what I just mentioned. If you're having a computer chip, then the typical way this is done is that there's a clock signal which tells when to compute and when to store the intermediate results before using them again in the next computational cycle. Mm-hmm. And ideally, this happens everywhere at the same time. So it can work like clockwork, or like in a factory where, the belt moves. Then there's a bit of working. Then the belt moves again. And it becomes more and more difficult to get this perfectly synchronized everywhere once you make your factory or your computer chip bigger and bigger. And then at some point, you run into the issue that the belt moves somewhere while somebody is working. Mm-hmm. One way of dealing with this is, making things slower.
That is not something you want in a computer, right?
Of course, you want to make it fast, but that means you need to make sure that the synchronization is good enough so nobody is working while the belt is moving.
Okay.
The second example is in cellular networks where the phones or end devices need to talk to the base station and back. And everyone does this basically in a shared room. Everyone is using the same air, and the radio waves are interfering with each other if multiple devices or base stations try to send at the same time. And if this happens too much, you can't hear each other. So what is done, again, a little bit like in the factory example, a bunch of them is sending at the same time, but they're far enough apart so they, don't interfere with each other too much. Everyone can still hear the message intended for them. Mm-hmm. But if time is off, then two close-by devices might send at the same time, and then both of them interfere with each other. It's like if you're in a room and too many people talk at the same time, you won't understand anymore what's being said to you.
Okay, so does the example of decreasing speed or increasing speed and thus limiting the error rate or increasing the error rate also work for cellular networks? Because if we think of 5G, which is being implemented.
Yes, very much so. So what happens here actually is with 5G, they're pushing for having shorter and shorter packages being sent, to some extent at least. Mm-hmm. And that requires more accurate synchronization, as otherwise one would have to slow things down. Mm-hmm. If I talk for a minute and I have to wait for a second to make sure that the next person then can safely talk, it's not a big deal. But if I talk for half a second and then I have to take 1 second of break, then we won't have as much bandwidth anymore.
So it's like me chopping onions in the kitchen. If I want to make sure I don't cut my finger and move it away in time, I just have to slow down. But if I want to have chop them really fast, I have to make sure my fingers communicate well with the hand that is moving the knife.
Yes, and it suddenly becomes a much more difficult and challenging job to do it right.
Okay, and so this is where your research is focusing on. You are working on improving these timing algorithms?
Yes, so we have beautiful theoretical results, but all the theory in the world doesn't change anything so long as it isn't implemented into something that can be used. Mm-hmm.
So to summarize, timing is important in distributed computing or distributed networks because if the timing is off, things go wrong.
Yes, if time is used for coordination and time is off, then coordination breaks down.
So what would happen in a cellular network if one cell phone tower has the wrong timing from somewhere?
Then it would start sending at the same time as the neighboring towers or devices in neighboring cells. And the devices in its cell would also start sending at the same time as these. And that would probably not only degrade bandwidths, but may even result in no reception. And, apart from this being an inconvenience, this might also be really a problem once we talk about really important messages, like in the case of some disaster. It's, of course, a classical example. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of internet services that use this in part. So if you have something that depends on this, could possibly also be that some factory is using some connectivity in order to organize their processes. So I expect that the liability of having an insecure mechanism for time synchronization will only grow in the future, because more and more things will rely on the connectivity via the cellular network.
Mm-hmm. So essentially, in a cellular network, everyone has to agree on whose turn it is when to speak or to send data. Otherwise, they will jam the whole bandwidth, because you said they are all sharing the same air, and then nothing will work anymore because it's like a room full of people screaming at the same time.
Yes. In the most extreme case, you will end up with that.
Okay, all right. But right now, how does this timing work? How do they manage to agree on one time? Where do they get their time from?
Well, funnily enough, from a positioning system. So the main source of time for these networks is GPS or Galileo or one of the positioning systems, because in order to figure out where you are, you need to figure out how far you are from places you know, which in these cases are the satellites. They know exactly where they are. But in order to figure out how far you are away from them, you need to know how long your signal is underway.
So cell phone towers get their information from satellites. So they also get it over the air, basically. And is there a way that someone that really wants to can override the signal and tell them, well, actually, it's now 10 o'clock and not 9 o'clock?
Unfortunately, that's very much doable, yes. So what you're describing would be called a spoofing attack. Somebody claiming to be the correct source of time. And that has been demonstrated already. In principle, there's a solution for that. The military actually employs it, but the civilian sector does not get the secured signals.
Okay.
And even if one would implement this, there's the additional issue that if spoofing may be hard due to proper security measures, it's still just possible to just shout and jam. And the difference here is that for the devices on the ground, I need to shout very loud. But the satellites are very far away, meaning that their signal is very, very weak. So it's much, much easier to jam them than ground-based sources, simply in terms of how much energy and effort.
You just have to be the strongest signal, basically.
It's not, no, for that you need to be loud enough to blot out everything else.
Okay.
Just because you're louder doesn't mean
Okay.
I can't understand someone else yet. But again, if somebody's whispering on the other end of the hall, then, I don't need to be very loud for them to not be heard anymore.
That makes sense. So there are two things. Timing is very important for cellular networks and will also get more important in the future when cellular networks like 5G or even 6G will become more implemented in industry. And we have you working on trying to make that more secure. So that is why the ERC Proof of Concept grant has been awarded to your project. Please tell us what it is about.
Okay, our project is called GradeSync, which is short for gradient clock synchronization. And the idea here is that we want to make the timing differences smooth across the network. Using more classic or traditional approaches, one ends up with the problem that the far away reference one uses for the time, in the case of a satellite, literally very far away, might end up in quite large differences in the observed time at close by cell phone towers, devices, etc. And by using instead an algorithm for synchronization where the close by devices talk to each other and try to agree on a time that locally works well as well, we can do much better. That's one component here. The other component is to make this secure despite using the wireless channel. And that is something where the work of Dr. Singh comes into play.
If you have been a listener of this podcast for some time, you might already know her, because Dr. Mridula Singh was a guest in our podcast in episode 4, where she talked about her work on securing wireless distance measuring. So go check that out. In summary, she said that wireless distance measuring is still something that needs more securing because there are attack vectors and so on. So please check that out if you want more information about that. But why are you including this also in your project? How do timing and distance measuring go together in this case?
In a way, time and distance are the same here. If I don't know how long a signal is underway, then I can't figure out the distance between the sender and the receiver. And if I can't figure out the distance between the sender and the receiver, I will not know how long a signal is underway. So if I send you the time, but I don't know how long this message is underway, then when you receive the message, the information is already stale. You know that I sent the signal when I thought it's 3 p.m.
Yeah.
But if you don't know how long it was underway, you can't figure out what my time is now.
Yeah, sure.
That's why these two things go hand in hand. And that's why the GPS signal is sort of used or / abused for getting the time rather than the position.
So if I get that right, with your algorithm, getting the time right would also be distributed across the network and not come from one specific source as in the satellites. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the underlying idea. We will still make sure to tie the network time, if you want, to such external references, because there are also other providers which may use completely different approaches, right? It's not like everyone will suddenly use our algorithm at the same time. And one still wants the connection to the one true time.
So if I get that right, the idea of your new algorithm is that whereas beforehand all base stations and devices on Earth basically receive their time signal from the satellites via GPS or related systems, and now your timing algorithm makes sure that this getting the time right is done distributed over the network in comparison to just receiving a time and taking it as true.
Yes. So we will have close by devices sort of talk to each other and adjust their time to match better. We still want to tie the overall time in the network to the true time that's provided by external sources. But it will be much easier to make sure that this happens because we don't need to do it everywhere anymore. I mean, strictly speaking, that's not even true now, right? If you're indoors, you will not have a GPS receiver here, but you will have it close by and have a wire. But what we have will just scale much better. So only a few points are good enough to tie the network time to the true external time.
So it's not cutting out the timing submission via satellites. It's just making sure that distributing it becomes more secure.
Yes, and also it means that if we do have a major outage, we're not completely dependent on the satellites anymore. For example, the network could maintain its own time, or we just have terrestrial sources like the National Meteorological Institutes keep very accurate time. We still can get the information from there. In the current system, the problem is that the very large distances will result in too inaccurate timing. We don't have that problem anymore.
And to transfer all this amazing research, this amazing fundamental research into a product that can actually be used on the market in the industry, you have founded a startup which is called Time Lords. It sounds a little like it's straight out of a video game. It's a very nice name. And what is the idea behind this startup? How do you want to make sure that this fundamental research does not stay simply foundational and become transferred into a product?
By building that product. Because we know precisely how this works or how it's intended to work, we have a much better chance at doing this and doing this in a timely manner. If we just, write a paper, put it on a shelf and wait for someone to pick it up and implement it, this might either never happen or take a very long time. So instead, we said, let's do this.
So as you said, you don't want your research to become stale by putting it in a bookshelf. You want to make sure it actually hits the market and makes the world a safer place.
Yes. I mean, I consider it, part of my job to actually do that if possible. Because, what's all the nice theory for if we can't apply it?
That's a good point, yeah. Seeing as you already mentioned that there are two examples, because you talked not only about the cell phone towers, but also about computer chips that are getting faster and faster and thus rely on accurate synchronization. Are there any other cases your algorithm will benefit aside from wireless communication as in cellular networks?
So on the one hand, time is a very fundamental thing.
That's
Virtually
true, yeah.
everyone needs it. So I'm fairly positive that this will find other applications if one goes and looks for them. Mm-hmm. But since you already pointed to that, let's look at the second case here. Mm-hmm. There, actually what happened is that the computer chips stopped getting faster.
Okay.
Already a while ago. This was, I think, until the early 2000s. The computer chips kept advertising their clock frequency because it went up and up and up and up. And at some point that stopped.
Yeah, that's true.
That's not an accident. It's because they couldn't scale this up further anymore. And one of the key obstacles here, if not the critical one, is that the classic approach of just having a single source of time and distribute this timing information everywhere by something which we call a tree. It branches out and gets the time everywhere. This is very similar to the situation we have in the cell phone networks. Again, if we apply this idea of viewing the different part of the chips as having their local time they can agree on, running the algorithm we have in mind, then we can make sure that the maximum time difference locally stays way smaller than with the classic approach. And since these local parts of the chip need to talk to each other, this means that we can run things smoothly and at a high frequency, like in this factory setting. I don't need to make sure that at the other end of the factory, everyone is perfectly in sync with me. I just need my neighbor to be in sync with me. So locally, things work right.
Yeah.
And that's the underlying idea here. That can give us the chance, or maybe the chip companies, the chance to move back to a design style they used before, where one could pretend that everything was perfectly synchronous. One could say that the more modern approaches right now have multiple factories which run on their own time, and then they just exchange products. Mm-hmm. That's fine to scale things up, but it's a bit inconvenient if you want communication to go quickly. And it's also just an overhead in the design.
So back in the day, when you had like single core processors, they just scaled them up to make them very fast, but they kind of hit like a ceiling because they couldn't get the timing right on the various parts of the chip. Is that correct?
Yes. And then they switched to basically saying, well, let's build more of the same and have these parts talk to each other without synchronization, or at least with much, much coarser synchronization.
Okay.
But that brings us back to this, well, now I need to wait for a longer time to make sure that the other one is done before I can look at what in this case they wrote to a register. It's not interference in the wireless communication. But I still need to make sure that before I look at what the result of a computation is, the one computing it is finished. Mm-hmm. So we run into a similar situation here. And the hope is that with our approach, this can be made easier again, like in the good old days.
And then we will see 10 gigahertz processors.
Probably not.
Well, one can dream. All right, Christoph, thank you very much for taking the time to explain your research for us.
My pleasure.
But before I let you go, I just have to ask you some quick questions that I have to ask every researcher that takes place in our podcast studio. So, first question. Christoph, do you use a password manager? And if yes, why? If no, why not?
The answer is no. And the why not is probably, well, maybe because I didn't look into it closely enough. I think when they were introduced, I felt that this is not really doing things the way I hope it would. Mm-hmm. And I guess then it basically dropped out of my field of vision. So, of course, I try to, generate proper passwords and make sure that I don't overuse them. But I guess I have to admit that for someone working at CISPA, I'm probably using substandard password security.
I mean, we can always improve, right? So there is a good episode on password security in this podcast, so maybe check that one out. Second question, have you ever fallen for a phishing email?
Not that I know of.
Okay. That's good to know. All right. As a cybersecurity researcher, do you handle your private data differently? For example, are you wary of sharing things on social media or using the web in a different way and being more careful with your data?
I'm generally reluctant to share a lot in the internet, if you want. Social media, I mean, it gets out there and it doesn't come back. I think that's partly due to, maybe security concerns, but it may also be in part due to personality.
Yeah, okay. What do you think of smart homes?
They will happen.
But you're not a fan, or you don't really have an opinion?
I think there will be things in there which are useful and needed, and there will be a lot of things which aren't, like with all the fancy stuff that happened before, which we now consider not fancy anymore, but part of everyday life.
Okay. And how do you feel about cryptocurrencies?
I like the underlying idea, or at least the way it was sold, with the plan to be not as dependent on banks and governments who could potentially abuse their power. But the result seems to be that now we have other people abusing their power on these cryptocurrencies. So far it didn't deliver what was promised, at least from my perspective. It might change in the future.
Okay, thanks a lot, Christoph. It was a pleasure having you here. I hope your research and also your startup will be very successful and make sure that the wireless communication of the future will be secure. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you too.
Bye.
Have a great day too.